Hey everyone, I'm Secular Spirit, and in this video I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I recently read a book about Islam. I actually have it over here. So the book is called Praying to the West, How Muslims Shaped the Americas. And as you can see from the price tag over here, it was pretty pricey. But the reason why I wanted to read it was because I found out that the writer, his name is Omar Mouallem, or Mouallem, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, was a former Muslim, now atheist, like myself. And I was curious to know, why would an ex-Muslim write a book about the history of Islam in the Americas? And by that he meant North America, Central America, and South America. So I'll talk a little bit about why Mouallem wrote the book later on in the video, but the first question I want to answer is this book worth reading? And I would say it totally is. So the book isn't a comprehensive or thorough history of Muslims in the Americas. The approach that Mouallem uses is he visits a different part of the Americas every chapter, and he spent a couple of years traveling across the Americas to write this book. So each chapter is a different stop. So he'll be in Brazil one chapter, and then he'll go to Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, and throughout the United States and Canada, where he was actually born and raised. And what's effective about this approach is it makes a heavy historical topic more easily digestible. You spend some time in one place, you learn a few interesting things about it, and then you move on somewhere else. And that gives you an overall sense of the rich diversity of Muslims in the Americas. And that's the best accomplishment of this book. It helps shatter the illusion or stereotype, whatever you want to call it, that the Western media in particular propagates about a monolithic Islam where all Muslims practice and believe the same thing, and that's just simply not the case. There's nearly 2 billion Muslims, and as I know from my own personal experience as a former Muslim myself, there is no such thing as a monolithic Islam, which I would actually say is something that causes problems for Muslims who want to know what to practice and believe. But that's a subject for another video. Going back to the book now, and one particularly moving chapter was about the community in Quebec City that endured a horrific shooting that killed 6 Muslims in 2017, and then in the aftermath it left the community struggling to balance the need for safety and security with the need to have an open mosque that operated and functioned as a community center for the Muslim community there. And so overall, in this sense, I think what this book has done is really admirable. What Mouallem has done is written a narrative of history that we don't normally see or hear about in books or in movies or in TV shows or whatever. It is a Muslim narrative of history in the Americas, and I can't even think of another book that's out there in the public mainstream that has done this. But now I want to get into why Mouallem wrote this book. So this book was born out of a journey Mouallem had of trying to figure out what Islam meant for him as someone who didn't believe in it anymore. When talking about when he finally decided to leave Islam, Mouallem writes, 3 hours into my fast, I started thinking about the emptiness of my loyalty. To what or whom, I didn't know anymore. I could practically hear the metaphysical rope snap when I finally bit into my lunch. And this is something that I went through myself. I remember it happening when I last fasted for Ramadan and realized I didn't believe in it anymore. And Mouallem also asks himself a question in this book that I still ask myself to this day. No doubt Islam has a place within me, but do I have a place within it? And this is partially what motivated Mouallem to write this book. He wanted to learn what Islam meant for him as he traveled across the Americas and met all of these Muslims in all of these different regions. But this is also where Mouallem and I diverge. So he writes, what I didn't expect was the sense of belonging I'd feel with most congregations. I began to wonder, can one be Muslim if he doesn't believe in its basic tenets, but seeks comfort in Islam's select messages and practices? So for me, I don't think you can be Muslim without the basic belief in those core tenets. But of course you can take the positive aspects of the religion while discarding the rest. What I find problematic is when people who are formerly Muslim or currently Muslim want to keep those positive aspects of Islam, and because of that they have to defend or in some way rationalize the toxic negative aspects of Islam. And that's ultimately what its biggest problem is. Although it is positive in many ways, Islam is a full package. You have to take the bad stuff with the good. And so Mouallem also talks about his journey away from Islam. In the introduction, he writes, "First it was I'm Muslim, then I'm agnostic, and finally I'm atheist, all said naturally with the self-importance of someone proclaiming themselves vegan. I started toning it down once I clued into the veiled bigotry of the new atheist movement and realized that my devotion to disbelief had become another type of zeal and blind faith. It was an ego trip with none of the spiritual nourishment." And this is another area where I kind of diverge from Mouallem. I think for people who dwell on atheism or only advocate for atheism, they're kind of missing the point. Atheism is like a reset button. It simply is a lack of belief in a god. It's a starting point from where you can build a new meaning and a new belief system for yourself. And for me, I don't think you need to have an organized religion or blind faith in a deity to get that kind of meaning and life guide. And I think to say that to have blind faith in atheism is a complete misunderstanding of what atheism is. Like I mentioned, it's a complete lack of belief, and so it's kind of a false comparison to liken it to having a blind faith in a religion. So Mouallem is searching for a kind of identity that fits Islam within his life because he feels a need to find something. And I think that's something a lot of ex-Muslims can relate to. And Mouallem relates this very interesting anecdote where he talks about this time he traveled to Israel and he was in Jerusalem, I believe, and he came across a checkpoint and an Israeli security guard stopped him and asked him for his religion. And for an ex-Muslim, that's a very tough question to answer because in the Middle East, your religion is really tied to your identity. And so, of course, Mouallem was clearly from a Muslim background and he wondered, should I just say this? In the end, he ultimately said he had no religion. And the funniest thing about that is the Israeli guard kind of looked at him with a sense of pity and just let him through. And that's what ex-Muslims deal with. There's this whole feeling that if you don't have a religion, then you're lost and you have no identity. But in the end of the book, Mouallem finds a way to make Islam work for him in a secular sense. Mouallem does a very brave thing, and I think it's very admirable, of sharing a very personal breakup that happened in his life. And he talks about the shattered dream of the child that he and his partner wanted to have together. And then he talks about how they managed to rebuild that dream. Mouallem writes, "It showed us both that we could bring No, which is the name of the child that they dreamed to have, back to life with immense mercy and compassion. I can't speak for where Janae, who's his partner, found hers, but I know I derived mine from the message of Islam. That there's no hatred that can't be healed, no anger that can't be reconciled, no act that can't be forgiven when you submit to something bigger than yourself. Islam was my framework for the radical forgiveness required of me." I think it's amazing that Mouallem wrote something this personal in this book, considering the countless people who are going to read it all over the world. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, I think that Islam can be positive in many ways, as you can see from Mouallem's own experience. But for me, I can't look at Islam in this positive light when so much of it is built on toxic ideas and fear and unjustified blind faith. I accept that Islam is part of my heritage and my culture, but I don't feel a need to defend it or to rationalize it. And this is, I think, also where I differ from Mouallem. I suspect that part of the motivation for writing this book was to defend Muslims, and I do think they need to be defended considering that they have been oppressed in all parts of the world, especially when you think of what's happening in China with the Uyghurs. But that doesn't mean that we can disregard the very problematic parts of Islam. For me, they're two separate things. Muslims should be treated well, but we should still criticize the problematic ideas of Islam. You can see examples of how Mouallem tries to defend Islam throughout this book. For example, he writes, "There's an assumption that Muslim and American values are incompatible, that you can't have one without subverting the other. Muslims in the Eastern Hemisphere are just as likely to believe this as non-Muslims in the West. Everyone else knows it's not true. It's a matter of learning how to make these values click together." What he's essentially saying is we should ignore or change the problematic parts of Islam to make them fit with American values or whatever values we're talking about. If you want to say more general humanist values or the values of the 21st century, we can say that. And you can argue that this is the process of what's happening in Islam, and it's very similar to the process that happened with Christianity, where many of the things in the Bible or many of the things that were practiced by Christians in the past are no longer really practiced today. Not always in every part of the world, but views on homosexuality and especially things like slavery have clearly changed. And you can obviously see that same process happening within Islam, just much slower. But for me, instead of trying to reinterpret Islam and make it fit here and make it fit there, I think we should build something new from the good parts of it and leave Islam in the past. So I suppose in that sense, I'm a bit more extreme in my beliefs of what we should do to address the problems of Islam than Mouallem is. But I do think we have the same general objective, and we want to get rid of the parts of Islam that divide us rather than unite us. For me, I think the best way to do that is to just get rid of Islam. For others, including moderate Muslims, they believe that Islam should just be reformed over a long period of time. But in the midst of all this, I think something has been interestingly forgotten, and that's the question of whether Islam is true or not. Does that matter? I think it really does, but I think for a lot of apologists for Islam, it seems to almost be secondary to the benefits that Islam serves countless Muslims around the world. Towards the end of many of the chapters in his book, Mouallem offers his analysis or insights or lessons learned from his experiences with the Muslims in that specific chapter. And in the chapter where he talks about the Moorish Science Temple of the United States, if you haven't heard of that, it's very interesting. It's basically this whole belief system that arose out of the need for Black Americans to find a better identity than that of the oppression and racism and slavery that they experienced in the past. And so what some of them did was they created a fictionalized history of a great Moorish kingdom that expanded over much of North and Western Africa. And of course, what's kind of interesting is that the term of the Moor, which they've appropriated, is actually a European term that was meant to just describe anyone from North Africa, and later on the Arabs that invaded Spain and other parts of southern Europe. So he writes about the followers of the Moorish Science Temple that they'd rather lean on other social constructs, nationalism and imperialism, reclaiming an ancient empire of a set of falsehoods no worse than the myths of scientific racism that enslaved their ancestors. And Mouallem almost kind of admires this, but what they're essentially doing is trading one set of falsehoods for another that serves them better. And that's, I think, a key problem of religions like Islam. The truth seems to almost be irrelevant if the religion offers you comfort and hope in the trying times of life. For me personally, I think living your life facing reality for what it is, instead of escaping into wishful thinking and fantasies that religions offer, is the better way to live your life. That doesn't mean we have to define ourselves by our pasts, especially if horrible things happen to us in the past, but that means we can learn from the past and improve ourselves and build for the future without forgetting where we came from and also not losing ourselves in it. And I'd be curious to know if Mouallem would agree with this or not. So just to cap off this video, I figured I'd give a rating, let's say out of 5 stars. So I would give Praying to the West 3.5 stars out of 5. I thought it was a very interesting read, especially considering I'm an ex-Muslim, and I really liked how Mouallem explored that challenge of how to define your identity when you're a former Muslim, although I disagree from some of his conclusions, and I think I'm much more critical of Islam than Mouallem shows himself to be in this book. As is often the case with these things, we disagree on the method and approach, but I think we have a lot of the same objectives. Thank you so much for watching this video, and in case you haven't already, please subscribe.